Good afternoon. It is now 12:35 p.m., so we're going to go ahead and get started. This is the Education, Youth, and Older Adults Committee. I'm the chair of the committee, Councilman John Bullock of the 9th District. We're also joined by Vice Chair of the committee, Councilman Mark Parker of the 1st District.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Member of the committee, Odette Ramos of the 14th District.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And also member of the committee, Councilman Jermaine Jones of the 12th District.
Thank you.
We also have Julian Jamad, who's our staff to our committee, who does some great work. Thank you for everything you do. We also have representatives from the mayor's office, from the Baltimore Children and Youth Fund, I believe, and other agencies, as well as along with representation from the Council President's office. So again, just thankful for everyone that is here today. For the subject of the day, 50100, Children and Youth Fund updates. This is a bill that we have heard to some degree in this committee in the past. We've had I got some testimony, but I do want to provide an opportunity for us today to look at the bill, potential amendments, and where we can find some collaboration. So again, with that, I will turn it over to Vice Chair Parker for his comments regarding this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for everybody. I want to thank again my colleagues for their steadfast commitment to Baltimore's young people and the work that we get to do on that here in this committee and many in different ways. And to Mr. Chair for your continued support, partnership, and leadership on this bill and in general our committee. The bill and updated amendments, 16 of them, which we'll get into, reflect extensive input from community leaders, stakeholders, staff of the Baltimore Children and Youth Funds, board members, current and former grantees, the administration. Thank you, Mr. Schnella, for all of your work here. The Council President, the Comptroller's Office, grateful for the Comptroller who joined us last time, the Law Department, Baltimore City Schools, and current colleagues and former council members. Especially grateful to everybody who made time, to grantees who invited me into their organizations and to give feedback, to the many grantees and BCOS staff who participated at the bill hearing in December. And in the very detailed feedback session for grantees in January. And thanks especially to President Lee and to Brandon for being present there for that. The City Council has a responsibility under the charter to define oversight, funding criteria, allocation methods, and operational rules by ordinance. And so that's the basis for the law that was passed in 2020 and for the revised ordinance that is before us now. The charter states that by ordinance, the mayor and city council shall provide for the oversight, governance, and administration of the Children and Youth Fund, including 1, methods and criteria for identifying specific program and services eligible for funding by the fund, 2, methods and criteria for allocating available funds among eligible organization programs and services, and 3, the establishment of any other legislative and administrative rules that seem necessary, kind of a standard boilerplate language. So that's the charter space in which we're operating today. The 2020 authorizing legislation for BCOF provided initial legal structure and operational framework for the organization that has helped support the tremendous growth and development of the organization since that time under the leadership of the board and President Lee and her staff. At the same time, the ordinance was made in anticipation of what the organization could become, and so it no longer reflects the organization's operational reality. As the Comptroller reminded us when we gathered last time, our former colleagues in the council at that time in 2020 did good work in writing and passing this ordinance, but gaps were of course left in the process with anything brand new, and important developments since that time required our renewed attention to the law. It's our responsibility as a council then, given the reality and the importance of this particular commitment in the form of BCYF to the young people of our city, to return to that ordinance and make updates to align the law with current practice, incorporate what we've all learned in the past 5 years, address gaps and ambiguities, and better support BCOF's mission and long-term sustainability. BCOF has done a ton of this work themselves. They have done so much good work over the last 5 years, five and a half years now since that law was passed, to develop a great staff, an engaged and dynamic board of directors, a robust community review process, establish partnerships around the city, and deploy for year after year after year significant public funds as grants to grassroots youth-serving community-based organizations. And they are to be commended for that. And every time they come here, they tell us those stories. We heard lots of those stories of that success at our public hearing. It only, for me, and I think for my colleagues, emphasized how important this commitment from the city is and the work that there is. I want to highlight 4 key things and then get into the bill as amended before us. There's 4 key aspects of BCOF this legislation is aiming to strengthen. One is community accountability in the form of the community grant-making review process, which determines how these public funds are stewarded and sent out, deployed to support youth-serving organizations. The second is technical assistance, especially working with grassroots community organizations. BCYF does excellent work making sure that they have the staff support, resources, guidance, and help to help them develop as organizations. And it's important that our law call that out and make sure it's fully funded, explicitly funded. The third is youth leadership on the board of directors. Youth leadership is a shared core commitment across the work of the entire organization, and this bill affirms and strengthens that commitment at the board level. And finally, it's about making sure resources get into the hands of organizations in as clear and consistent a way as possible, as appropriate with public funds, making sure that those resources continue to be deployed across the city where they can do the most good. In terms of the bill itself, what I'd like to do is to walk through, so the bill has been through an extensive amendment process, thanks to lots of great community review that we mentioned before. That began in the spring and took place all summer long. This fall, once it became public, it's been lots of individual conversations with all kinds of folks, as well as some shared conversations between the comptroller, BCOF, and myself, between the mayor's office, BCOF, and myself. Our very lengthy and informative bill hearing on the subject, and then this January, as promised at that bill hearing, a community bill review process, bill review session with grantees. And so rather than present the bill that was back in September and then the amendments, what I'd like to do is walk through what the bill would look like as amended, because I think that will give us the better sense of where the bill stands as of today, and allow us to see the evolution of the bill based on all that feedback. Great. All right.
And while you're doing that, I just want to note we've also been joined by committee member Zach Blanchard, councilman for the 11th District.
Good. Okay, starting from the top of that, if I can you pass me the empty one over there? Yeah, thanks. Just walking down through this one. Yeah, sure.
And while you're doing that, we're also being joined by our council vice president and member of the committee, Sharon Green Middleton of the 6th District. Thank you for being here.
Very good. All right, as we walk down through this, I should say, very unofficial reprint designed to help help our conversation today. We begin with a few at the beginning changes here that to some definitions, specific definitions. In particular, I want to draw the attention here on the first page under G to fiscal sponsor. At our last committee hearing, Councilperson Torrance brought up fiscal sponsorship, so did grantees, so did BCOF leadership. This is the process by which an organization which is not currently a nonprofit and may never become a nonprofit works through a larger nonprofit to apply for grants and access funds. And so there's a number of places in here where the language of fiscal sponsorship has been added to make sure that we are not excluding any grassroots organization from being able to access these funds. The next main portion here has to do with the grant process and procedure. To begin with here, when I initially drafted the bill, I had no thought or intention to weigh in on the grant process and procedure as it currently exists. I think BCOF has done a really good job managing that process, and that wasn't, from my perspective, an area of the law that needed to be addressed. The law department, though, brought up the charter framework that I mentioned before, which says that BCYF, which says that the city by ordinance is responsible for, sorry, I'm flipping to the right place. Is responsible for identifying the methods and criteria for allocating available funds among eligible programs and services. And so based on that law department feedback and recommendation then, what we did was we went through and said, okay, inasmuch as the 2020 bill is silent on that, even though the charter says that it's our responsibility to do it, what's the best way to approach that? And so we started with BCOF's current operations and said, okay, how can we look at what they're doing and try to capture that in the most simple and straightforward way in the law, as well as while leaving important space for flexibility for BCYF to make adjustments to the grant application process as needs change. That flexibility is done in two ways, you'll see in the amendments. The explicit way in the amendments is to say, listen, every 3 years, BCOF is responsible for a triennial needs assessment. And so it's really important that then the results of that needs assessment be integrated into the criteria for organizations to apply and receive funds, so that BCYF can say, listen, our needs assessment showed A, B, and C needs, and therefore we're gonna incorporate that into this next round of grants so that we are responding to the needs that we've identified. BCOF asked for that amendment, and so we included it in there.
Mr. Vice Chair, just really quickly, and I want to save committee questions for you until you finish, but can you articulate what the issue is that the law department raised or that you're identifying, just so we're all clear?
Yeah, absolutely. So from the law department report, bill report, so I'm just looking for the spot where I have the quote. Give me a second.
And then I also want to know for folks who are here that BCYF also has a presentation that we'll get into after we go through the bill. So I just want people to be aware.
Sorry, sir. One second, I'm just gonna pull it up on Legistar. I apologize.
And while Law's here, do you want to speak on it while Councilman's looking?
Yeah, Councilman Jeff Hochstetler from the law department. In the law report, I think the section you're referring to is the fourth paragraph on the first page, which simply points out that under the enabling charter provisions, the ordinance itself needs to provide for the methods and criteria for identifying the specific programs and services eligible for funding.
Yep.
So just for clarity, say that again, because again, I'm just thinking about what is missing from what we have now versus what you just mentioned.
So what is currently present is that first responsibility from the charter. The first responsibility from the charter is identifying the methods and is laying out the methods and criteria for identifying specific program and services eligible for funding. So the 2020 law talks about what kinds of organizations are eligible, what kind of work they do, what makes them eligible. There's 4 or 5 criteria, what makes them eligible for these funds. The second part of the charter says methods and criteria for allocating available funds among eligible programs and services. So here are these eligible organizations, here is this money, how does the money get to them? How is it allocated to them? And so the charter says it's up to the city council by ordinance, city council mayor by ordinance to do that work, to describe the allocation process. And so that's what this amendment tries to do. The 2 pieces of flexibility built in, one are the one I mentioned before at the request of BCYF, which ties it back into the triennial needs assessment. The other portion is in fact what's not stated, right? There's what's stated and what's not stated. Because what's stated here is the most kind of bare bones process for applying possible, it leaves room for interpretation and flexibility on the part of BCOAF to add additional things that they need to see, right? So like, here are the most basic things that, like the minimum you're required to see in the application, but other things are not excluded. And so BCOAF can add other things that are specific to a specific program, are specific to evolving needs, or specific to, in their expertise, what would make for a stronger application or better for them to evaluate. So that's the flexibility that's baked into that to that grant process.
Thank you for the explanation. Also want to know we've been joined by committee member, Councilman James Torrance of the 7th District.
All right, as we go through then, the grant-making process is there. The next portion is that there are reports from grantees which are required. Especially in this case, regular fiscal reports to BCOF. Currently, reporting is also governed by, described in the grant manual for BCOF and the MOU with Baltimore City. We heard a lot about reporting requirements. There's two aspects. There's the cadence of the report. This sets it at quarterly as the baseline expectation, which is consistent with the memo, but current practice is a monthly basis within the organization. So this sets the baseline at quarterly and defines 3 exceptions to when quarterly reports, fiscal reports wouldn't be included. That third exception was in particular in response to feedback from BCOF, which wanted a little bit more flexibility, and so it gives broad flexibility to BCOF. If there's anything that looks questionable or iffy or just looks like an area for improvement that BCOF sees in a grantee, then they have that authority to require monthly reports to make sure that that's there.
Just really briefly, I want to get through most of the report, but again, if you have a quick one, Councilman Torrance, is it? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, James. The next piece is the audit, which again, Councilperson Torrance brought up, and we had a conversation with the representatives from the Comptroller's Office at our last hearing.
Mr. Chair, I just want to make a request that as you're going through, please say the page number and the section that you're looking at.
Sure.
So we can be able to follow a little bit
Absolutely.
better. Thank you so much.
Absolutely, I'm on page 9F, about two-thirds of the way down the page.
Thank you.
Yep. So this calls for, this was in the bill originally and continues there. It calls for a 3-year performance audit, every 3-year performance audit. The current MOU includes an audits clause, but as the comptroller presented last time, without something structured and scheduled that they can prepare for staff-wise and budget-wise, there was no really way for them to operationalize that. And so this takes that general power to do audits, and at the request of the comptroller, the comptroller's office says it'll happen on an every 3-year basis. For the board of directors, what we have here is currently the size of the board is set between 9 and 20. Still on page 9, just 2 lines down, 9-5 board of directors, B. The number of voting members of the board, full board shall not be less than 9, no more than 20. This increases it to 30 and 21. Especially as the organization has grown in size and complexity, especially as the board has been tasked with greater roles for oversight as well as for fundraising. A larger board helps the organization be more deeply engaged with different perspectives and communities from around the city, draws in people with different experiences, professional and personal, their lived experiences, and make sure that there is enough space in particular for youth leaders on the board. The current board is, I checked from my last board invitation and also on the website, currently there are 13 board members. And so that's the current size of the board after the addition of a number of youth members over the last year and the appointment of me as the council person by the council president. Other changes here to the board, again, emphasizing the importance of youth voice and youth participation. There's a member of the Baltimore City Youth Commission determined by the vote of the members of the Youth Commission who would have, so there's a seat reserved on the board of directors for a member of the Youth Commission determined amongst themselves. That's a change, originally had been designated by the council president, but much better to empower the young people themselves to select their representative to serve on the board. And then there is adjustment to language. The current language was fairly broad in terms of reflecting the diversity of the city. The grantees in particular spent a lot of time both at our session and afterwards giving feedback on this. And so the current version here, amended version, has the board shall reflect the economic, social, cultural, and geographic diversity of the city and shall reflect the racial demographics of the city as reflected in the most recent publicly available United States Census data on Baltimore City youth ages 0 to 24. We'd initially had Baltimore City schools enrollment data, but BCOF very helpfully and importantly pointed out that BCOF serves from birth to age 24. And so that would be the most appropriate demographics to use because that's the target audience for the organization. And so we were glad to make that adjustment at their request. The youth waiver portion is strengthened to make it essentially harder to have a waiver for youth participation on the board. The minimum is retained at 1/3. Originally, we had dropped it to 25%. And there was lots of feedback that that wasn't a direction anybody wanted to go, and that's great. Our goal here is to make sure that youth leadership is not only 1/3, but is as high as possible on the board, and that the waiver process is harder to, a waiver to that minimum is harder to achieve, and if achieved, can only happen with a very specific plan for redressing the absence of youth leadership in a timely fashion. In particular, if there's ever fewer than 2 members of the board who are youth, then the board needs to present a plan immediately, needs to notify the Board of Estimates immediately and present to the Board of Estimates a plan for addressing that within 90 days. We simply can't, under no circumstances can we operate in long-term situation without youth leadership on the board. We're on page 11 now, ethical procedures. This is the recusal process, the conflict of interest policy. It matches both at the recommendation of the mayor's office, the opioid restitution fund, and the way that's set up, as well as matching BCOF's existing conflict of interest. And so this is not making adjustments, it's codifying something that's really critically important for the functioning of the organization and making sure it shows up everywhere, everywhere that's necessary. Excuse me. The annual financial plan, we're on page 12 now, 9-6, annual financial plan. There's 2 aspects here that are important. One is that under 9-6A, the description of the annual financial plan in the 2020, this is an example of where things were left a little short and a little vague in 2020, and we can come back to it. Now, the annual financial plan was supposed to include a budget and an amount to be dispersed. BCYF has presented way more than that in their annual financial plan. They've been really good about including lots of documentation and information to help city leadership understand exactly what they're doing and that everything's in order. And we really appreciate that level of communication and transparency. And so we wanted to match that by saying, hey, that's exactly what we want to see. Thank you for doing it. Let's keep it up. And so you have then a budget, amount to be dispersed, but also balance of the fund, amount of money the fund received from property tax assessments the last fiscal year, the audit results, which are also found elsewhere, and an updated plan and progress report on the disbursement of the multi-year balance of the fund, which has been a subject of great interest and conversation. The financial plan right now, think of it as it's really the budget, has three kind of allowable expense categories, divvied up by 5% for public engagement, 20% for administration, 15% for 5% for public engagement, 15% for administration, and 80% for funds directed to support local organizations, community-based organizations. This proposes breaking it into 5 areas. In particular, taking that 80% and saying 60%, 20%. 60% for direct grant making, 20% for technical support and capacity building, which the bill says that BCOF is supposed to do. We all know how important it is, but the financial plan didn't ask for it or didn't set a percentage for it. And so it made it open to outside criticism to say, oh, you're spending too much on this. And this is coming back and saying, no, BCOF has said consistently every $3 of grants we put out, so that's at 60%, we want to spend $1. We want to spend $1 on technical support, and so that's where you get that 60-20 breakdown of that 80%. And so we really appreciate BCOF helping us get to that number and making sure we understand exactly the way they approach that, and making sure that the city council then has said, no, please spend that money it's critically important. We really want to support the work you're doing on capacity building, right? The final thing it does is it breaks up the public engagement into two different categories. It still retains 3% for public engagement, and it sets aside 2% for the community grant review process, which is a critically important part of what makes BCOF a unique, equitable, and effective funder in the city of Baltimore, is that grant applications are reviewed by well-trained and supported members of the community who review the applications, score them, and ultimately are at the heart of deciding who gets funded. That was already included as one of the 4 spending categories within public engagement, but it felt very palpably different to me. And as the other ones were about promotion, billboards, websites, social media, kind of external communication. And then there was this one thing sitting there, was like this really critical grant review process, which is how we determine how funds are sent out into our city. And I was like, hey, that's really important. It doesn't really fit into like the external communication, right? That's an internal core grant making process. And so let's make sure that it has the funding it needs at 2%, and making sure that it's called out as a specific function as opposed to as an independent function, or as opposed to one that's just swallowed up inside the broader category of public engagement. I want to acknowledge BCOF and I are not on the same page in that regard. We've had fruitful conversations, and so that's one area where we haven't quite gotten there, but I really appreciate the information they've shared and the conversations we've had about it. Here on page 13, the bottom half, there were a number of parts of the original bill that we have crossed out based on feedback. What is remaining are there under 3 grant amounts limitations, and 2 particular things. One is the size of a grant may not exceed 20% of the total amount of money dispersed by the fund as grants in any fiscal year. BCOF has a deep and profound and a well-established commitment to funding grassroots organizations. And so this says, hey, that's a really important thing that's become an established part of the DNA of the Baltimore Children Youth Fund. And so let's make sure we encourage that by making sure that large chunks of money aren't being dispersed in one single grant, right? To one single grant. We've had really good conversations with the mayor's office about this in particular. And I think there's some flexibility on that, and with BCOF as well. Some flexibility on that front. I would consider it to 25% as a compromise moving in that direction, and have talked about that with the mayor's office. The second piece that's there under grant amounts limitations, 2, the board may not award a grant to any organization that does not follow the policies and procedures established under 9.4D of the subtitle. And this say, listen, there's no shortcuts, there's no sideways way to access resources. These are public funds. It needs a consistent public process that involves community review, that is open to all eligible organizations. It's not by invitation. It's not by relationship based. It's consistent. It's public. It's accountable. And so any organization, whether that's a city agency, whether it's a nonprofit community organization, has the same access, the same equitable access to funds through the established process.
Just one quick question, and I may hear a little bit from Councilman Torrance on this, but just for clarity, is there a not a specific situation, but is there a specific circumstance that you're speaking to as it relates to this piece you just mentioned?
Yeah.
In terms of following procedure, I want to make sure. And then, did you have something related to this as well, Torrance? Yeah. Just go ahead and ask it, and then we'll.
Yeah, I did. So I'm the public process portion of it. There can be candid conversations about applications in a public space. So I'm just wondering, because I see the words public hearing and the process. A lot of times at board meetings, those applications are discussed. And the other pieces, and I think the law department should opine this too. When you're discussing grants, you're discussing financial information of organizations. So we're not allowed to publicly discuss certain organizations' their finances.
And again, thank you for that, because I think we had a similar question. Like I said, I still want to make sure we get through the presentation, but I think there are some things that are pressing that are useful as we go through this. So
yeah, we're almost
if
there.
Law had something, or if you had something, that's fine.
Yeah, I'm gonna tap in along in a second. No, Councilman Torrance, I really appreciate that. When I say a public process, I mean a process that itself is publicly understood and available. Not that every portion of it in any way, shape, or form is public. And if you read through the amendment describing the process, it's very clear about all of those things. So yes, to everything you said about the way that the board talks about things, the way that applications are received, the information sent in, that's not public information. It's not talked about publicly. But the process itself is publicly understood. Everybody knows, any organization, any person that is interested in applying knows that this is how my application will be handled. And I know that that's true for me just as much as it is for a city agency or any other community-based organization, that I know and can trust that this is the process that will be followed.
And I'm glad BCYF is here because again, we'll hear again what some of the back and forth is. So again, make sure that everybody's clear. Please proceed.
Absolutely. And so one of the ways this came up, and I'll turn to law here in a second, the initial bill referred to an invitation only process that currently exists. And when we put that in front of the law department initial bill, the law department came back and said, with public funds, there can't be an invitation only process. That given that it's public funds, the process has to be open to all eligible organizations and can't be on the basis of invitation. I'll turn back to the law department to say more about that side of things.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. With regard to the sort of open discussion, a review panel, a community review panel created by the law would likely need to comply with the Open Meetings Act. And, but just, the discussion doesn't necessarily need to imply that you're disclosing the potentially confidential documents.
So Jeff, it's just not, so this is why, I mean wholeheartedly, that we need to take time on this, because some of the flexibility that was written in their MOU that was granted to them, plus what's actually happening in this document, is not consistent with what best practices are outside of government. And then I'm just being transparent. I am still taken back by the money grab for staffing for the comptroller's office for doing the audits, when as an organization, they can actually physically provide a single audit to the comptroller's office and do a performance audit. And that is circumventing our budget process, because we then are creating an emphasis in the next fiscal year to actually fund it. And then the cost that I saw was, to me, taken aback when I can go to a CPA and get a cheaper price related to our government. So I'm taken aback because while I think you're being thoughtful, I think that this is something that's going to probably take longer than the time period that we have to get it done correctly, but also recognize that for funds that are for traditionally organizations who are not traditionally funded through traditional grant-making organizations, it's going to be expressively difficult, because in just knowing from some of the people that have been granted funds, there's a lot of hand-holding, right? And some of that can't be public, right? Like the technical assistance and then the correspondence, I think that I've read through it and I have a lot of questions in terms of process, because I see ambiguity where there is like no flexibility. And I put your bill up against their MOU, that's with the BOE. And I'm just being transparent. I rather just keep the MOU and then create requirements from when they have to go to BOE to get updates to their MOU, to update those processes and tell them to dictate that they need to create these public processes and have them be constantly reviewed by the council. That way it's still a public process and it's not too prescriptive to limit them. There's areas of flexibility there. I think there's many ways to skin a cat, but this one seems very, I'm telling you how to run this thing versus I want to partner with you and allow the public to see how this thing runs.
I also say, thank you, Councilman Torrance, for raising that. And I'm sure not only the Comptroller's Office, BCYF may have something to say about that as well. And again, a point's well taken. If you could just finish out, Councilman Parker, and then we'll, because I know there's more questions I can anticipate as well.
Very good. The final pieces here have to do with annual reports and the public hearing. We're on the top of page 15 right now. Right now, March 31st is the deadline by which BCUF comes and presents has a public hearing with us around their operations. And so in collaboration with BCUF, we also added that as part of that, prior to that public hearing, the independent third-party financial audit from the fund from the previous fiscal year will be sent over to the city council so that we can consider that as part of their report. And I appreciate BCUF's help in working through the timing of that and making sure that it worked. The final piece here is under annual reports from the board. So no later than June 30th each year, the board shall prepare and submit a report to the mayor and city council that shall include the current law said detailing the activities and impact of the funds. This goes into significantly greater detail around what that annual report should include. Our current annual report from BCUF is very extensive, had lots of information about grantees and their work, about the organization, about the board and its development. That's been a really helpful development on their side. They've provided the mayor and the city council really important information about their activities. And so this is trying to say, hey, listen, let's keep that best practice up. You all have done a great job developing what it is that we need to see. And so let's just spell out some of those things so we keep seeing that in the future. Here on page 16, the Director of Finance, a lot of the confusion and conversation around this has been about the role of the Department of Finance in making sure the funds are flowing appropriately and quickly and smoothly to BCUF and therefore to grantees. And so this asks that the Department of Finance also reports back to the mayor and city council about what that's looked like over the past year, how they've sent out the funds they're required to, and what the fund's balance is and things like that. So asking Department of Finance to add a little bit more information to our mix. The final very small thing here goes back to the conflict of interest policy in our Article 8 around ethics. This is page 16 and 17. The current law didn't distinguish between Baltimore Children and Youth Fund, which is the non-lapsing fund established by the charter, and Baltimore Children and Youth Fund Incorporated, which is the fine organization headed by President Lee. And so as DLR was trying to clean up everything, they were like, we need to make sure we specify both. I should say that this is already happening. The BCUF and its board of directors have been, and non-clerical employees have been submitting these reports to the city ethics department. So this isn't adding anything new. This is just DLR wanted us to make sure we didn't forget to clean up this portion while we were dealing with the law.
All right, well, thank you, Mr. Vice Chair, for a very extensive report. Before pivoting to BCYF, are there any pressing, clarifying questions that any members of the committee have at this point? And then also, is there any feedback or response from any of our agencies that are here?
I have one, Mr. President.
Go ahead, Councilman Torres.
Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President. So I see the youth commission. I rather have us, if they cannot meet the number for the youth, which is 1/3, in the amendment that we add additional youth members and we provide them the technical training to be members of that board. That way, it's not a leverage. If we can't leverage it from outside interests that we already have young people who are interested, I'd rather provide them with the leadership and development and training to be on the board, and then add that as a programmatic update to what the youth commission offers. So if we found one and then we're falling short and there's 4 members of the youth commission that can fill in that other portion, we can then add them and then provide them the technical assistance to do it. Because I know a lot of funds and organizations that you guys have partnered with around the country, they actually have to pay a firm to go out, find youth, train them, and do board development training for an entire year before even inserting them onto the board.
I'll just say thank you for raising that, and that's kind of the reason why I wanted to ask if there are any questions, because there might be some things that BCYF in their presentation or their response may be able to address. So again, that's one. Is there anyone else? Councilman Jones?
Just one quick question. I'm not sure if anyone knows offhand, but anybody, any idea or aware of the percentage of the fund that the Baltimore Youth Works, that grant was, just to give me context of that 20%? You know,
I think maybe the mayor's office may have some sense of what that looked like.
Yeah, let me get the number for you.
Okay, thanks.
All right, if there are no other questions at this point, we'll wait for that response. Any other questions? Going once, going twice? Okay, let's go ahead and shift to the presentation. And again, we appreciate representatives of the Youth Fund being here. To the sponsor and Vice Chair's point, again, our efforts are to be collaborative, right? So again, this should be a back and forth, and there should be a way for us to make sure that our young people and our youth serving organizations are getting the resources they need. So again, Director Lee, please go right ahead.
Vice President Bullock and Vice Chair Parker and members of the committee. I'm Alicia Lee and the President and CEO of the Baltimore Children and Youth Fund. I'm joined here today by Hannah Zaro, who is the co-director of grant making for the compliance side, and our Vice President of External Affairs, Brandon Hansen, and the Executive Assistant as well, Logan Monroe. Today, we are presenting findings from a legislative impact survey conducted with BCYF grantees regarding this bill and its amendments. And so our purpose today is to share some implementation feedback directly from the organizations that serve Baltimore's young people every day, and to offer some practical recommendations that we think will strengthen accountability while also preserving effectiveness of the work. I'm using the clicker, but it's not working. Takes a minute. Thank you. We're here for 4 reasons. So we're here today to share what we've heard from grantees and community partners. And second, to highlight some operational and equity impacts that were raised in the survey that still continue to be present in the bill. Third, to provide some recommendations. And fourth, to offer some practical amendments and clarifications for consideration of the council. Before we proceed, I do want to acknowledge that BCYF has received media attention and public scrutiny in the last year, and we take that scrutiny so seriously because these are public resources and they require public trust. And public trust is built through transparency, strong controls, and measurable results. So we're hoping that today's presentation will reflect our commitment to those things: transparency, accountability, improvement, and results. Our objectives today are to center grantee and community voice, to protect trust-based community-centered grant making, to prevent policy decisions today that increase administrative burden on organizations that are already burdened, to reinforce equity as a practice, to strengthen accountability, and also to avoid unintended duplication or operational constraints that have been proposed by the current bill, since BCYF operations are already governed by a city MOU. And so at the end of this, I'm going to lay out a 3-piece call to action, which is to focus the legislation on methods and criteria. So to focus on oversight principles and not operational procedures. Even codifying step-by-step grant-making procedures into city code is just not advisable and not a best practice. Also to incorporate targeted amendments that we have to share today based on grantee feedback, like restoring the 5% allocation for community engagement, and convening a structured working session prior to the final passage of this bill that's led by BCYF and our grantees, so that we can make sure that we have robust feedback from multiple stakeholders. And we think that'll really strengthen transparency and ensure that the final language really reflects a collaborative implementation process. Next slide. So not that I need to tell you all, but what BCYF was created to do by Baltimore voters was to center community voice, advance equity, invest in youth-serving organizations, and strengthen the youth development ecosystem. BCYF our mission is to support youth development organizations and leaders, and our vision is for a more just, abundant, and creative Baltimore. Since 2020, we have invested over $42 million into the youth development ecosystem by grants alone. More than 300 hours of training programs and technical assistance. This year alone, we have 300 hours of technical assistance being provided to the community. Over 100 organizations are funded by BCYF, with more than 80% of them being multi-year grants, and we currently serve more than 17,000 opportunities, youth seats opportunities in our city. In addition, we are very proud, and it should always be mentioned, around the ways that the work that we're doing has really enhanced compliance of our grantees. And so in 2023, before the Learning Lab and all of our technical assistance rolled out, before our team was in place and the grant making team, we had 30% compliance when grantees were on their own working to traverse the very difficult process of being a BCOF grantee. And within 1 year, we were able to elevate that number to 92%. And every year, we've been able to grow that number. And now we're at 96% of compliance. In addition, we've got a dual grant-making approach. In our strategy, we invest in both programs and people. And so 75%, $3, it's really 75% of every dollar, so $3 to every one, right, goes towards direct grant-making dollars in the form of a direct grant, and the rest of our grant-making funds are in the form of capacity building, which is an equity approach that organizations all across the country reach out to us to learn more about. We're really excited, actually, we're going to St. Louis in 2 weeks to present on a national scale about the incredible dual grant-making approach at BCYF. And we also have a balance of accountable structures in place. We have a city MOU, we have an annual independent audit, and all of those audits have always resulted in no material findings. We have our, of course, standard IRS nonprofit reporting. We have a unfortunately, risk-based financial monitoring system, and I say unfortunately because it really does pose a big administrative burden to our grantees to have to produce such strenuous financial reports. Post-award site visits, we also have an annual city council hearing, and of course, we have city reporting and performance audits that are always available. And I believe one has taken place prior to my coming on. Our survey that we're gonna present now reflects grantees, some of our partners, community-based organizations. 82% of the organizations are tax exempt and 16% are fiscally sponsored. And so this is really a great representation of our overall grantee body and is a great, I would say, ecosystem level feedback piece. Overall, the sentiment was very clear that there's high concern. 89% of the grantees have shared that they are very or somewhat concerned about the bill as it stands. 7% were supportive and 4% were neutral. And the overwhelming view is that the bill would reduce flexibility and increase administrative burden for youth-serving organizations. Respondents identified 5 major concerns. 91% shared that flexible youth programs like the Youth Empowerment Program would be harder to run. That there would be 84% said that rapid response funding would be weakened. 89% said that detailed statutory requirements would limit BCOF's ability to improve processes. 87% said that reporting burden would reduce time serving youth. And 82% said that community voice and funding decisions would be reduced by the bill as it currently sits. So these are operational impacts, not theoretical ones, and they're really important to note. So this is what we heard and what we recommend, some practical adjustments to strengthen accountability while preserving effectiveness. So 89% of the surveyed folks agreed that codifying detailed grant procedures into city law would make it harder to improve processes over time. Operationally, this looks like BCOF would be locked into outdated models unless legislation is amended over time. In addition, continuous improvement would require statutory change rather than policy adjustment. I also want to say, just as another member of the national field that's leading organizations that are voter-approved children funds, there is a national trend to take these funds back to referendum and to eliminate them. We are concerned about that. We know that there's, we know you've shared that your intention is to also take the fund back to referendum. And we're concerned as well about that. Oh, that wasn't my understanding from our last meeting with the grantees. So that's really helpful to put on the record. So our recommendation is to keep operational grant procedures governed through the MOU and BCYF policies, not city code. Legislation should set guardrails and principles, not step-by-step operations. So one such example directly from the lines and pages of the current bill is the community grant review profile that's in the bill currently is different than even what's required for a board member. So for instance, board members are allowed to be Baltimore County residents if they have a Baltimore City, if they can prove that they work in the city in some meaningful way. And this bill would not allow a community grant reviewer to live in the county. Also, our board members have to be between the ages of 14 and 24. This bill requires a community grant reviewer has to be 16. So there's just all these different ways of on these step-by-step operations. It's just, I don't think necessary and doesn't allow us to be flexible. Youth programs requiring real-time adaptation. So 91% agreed that fixed timelines would make programs like our YEP program, which is a rapid response program for partnerships throughout the city. That would make that program impossible to run. We wouldn't be able to run a community grant review process in time to be able to respond rapidly. So these kinds of opportunities that follow school calendars, seasonal cycles, and urgent needs, there wouldn't be funding. We wouldn't be able to provide funding for those components. And if funding timelines are rapid, youth lose access to those programs, and that means delays in youth opportunities. So our recommendation is to explicitly preserve flexibility for youth-centered programs and to avoid statutory timelines that restrict program design. Up next is the idea around rapid response for emergencies. So 84% agree that fast funding programs will become harder or impossible to operate, like our mini grant program, which is the program where organizations that are struggling to pay for the often costly requirements, city requirements around insurance and workers' comp, things like that, folks can get additional funding to pay for those pieces. Those programs would be annexed by this bill, and so 98% say the bill would limit BCOF's ability to respond quickly to those types of urgent needs. Emergencies require a quick turnaround, and so our recommendation is to maintain authority for expedited grant-making processes with BCYF. Obviously, we can work harder to come up with some outcomes or accountability expectations that really meet the needs of the council. Next up is the community voice as the core feature of BCYF, and that we believe that 82% believe that the bill language would limit youth or community role in funding decisions by eliminating the public engagement allocation and reducing it to 3%. And so what this means that we're weakening community engagement, reduces trust, and of course, equity impact. And so the participatory models that require staffing and investment to run well would be annexed there. And so the recommendation is to restore the public engagement allocation to 5%. We also have emerging leaders needing support pathways. So the current bill, as it states, 87% agree that restricting capacity building to only tax-exempt organizations or fiscally sponsored organizations would harm grassroots growth across the city. So many emerging leaders operate through fiscal sponsorship early on, but some folks operate through more alternative methods of providing youth programming. Many of you know that because they work in your communities. And so excluding them undermines the ecosystem pipeline. And so what it means is that many community-rooted organizations that operate non-traditionally would not be able to tap into technical assistance. And it also excludes them from that pipeline of being able to build and grow the capacity of their programs. So our recommendation is to allow capacity building for all members of Baltimore's youth development ecosystem. Let's see, caps. So 87% of the grantees report that the 20% cap limits long-term investments and catalytic funding. So programmatic funding is a key component of philanthropy, but also making investments and making systemic investments like the Aligned Grant Making program has done in the past, in things like data systems or a collaborative summer process are really important larger investments. These help and are required to scale impact across the city. And these caps can unintentionally create and penalize high-performing organizations that are ready to take on those larger scale pieces to promote impact across the city. And so our advice is to remove or revise the 20% cap to allow board-approved strategic investments along with the grantees at that 87%. So just a recap of the programs that are most likely to be harmed by the bill as it currently sits is the President's Fund, which is a fund that is able to be flexible and support grantees with things like mini grants. Capacity building programs would be greatly reduced by the current bill. The Youth Empowerment Pop-Up Partnership Program, which is a rapid response partnership program that we launched in the summer of 2025, would also be canceled by this process. The community review panels would be revised by the current bill, and the Charm City Youth Athletics Fund would also have to end and be under the current bill with the current requirements. Let's see. Respondents believe the bill would most affect small grassroots organizations, new organizations, youth-led organizations, organizations without stable administrative infrastructure, and programs requiring rapid deployment of funds. Respondents also believe the bill would unintentionally reinforce inequity by raising barriers to access BCYF. These quotes that I'm going to share now are representatives of some broader themes that were reflected across responses, and we're happy to provide even a listing of all of the quotes that were shared. But I'll share 3 direct quotes. That BCYF goes beyond traditional grant-making models. The restrictions would hamper the ingenuity that makes the model effective. More time would be spent on administrative minutia and less time serving youth. Any changes should prioritize accessible funding pathways for smaller community organizations. These voices reflect the lived operational reality of so many of the organizations that we work to support. So what we've heard in summary is that if grant processes in the law reduce flexibility, we should work to keep operations governed through the MOU and through policy by working collaboratively together with the City Council. If YEP and other flexible programs are constrained, our recommendation is to protect that flexible program authority so that organizations can get access to resources. Just a reminder, these are organizations, many of them have been working in your districts for decades without any resource, selling fish dinners and using their own paychecks for other people's children to have access to programs in their communities. If rapid response is weakened, we recommend that we allow expedited funding mechanisms. If community voice is reduced, is what we've heard, we recommend to restore the 5% for community engagement. We've heard that emerging groups will lose support through the current bill and not have access to capacity building, which has been a lifeline for many organizations, and also a pathway towards being able to become a grantee, that we preserve the ecosystem-wide capacity building, and if caps limit strategic investments, that we revise or remove the 20% cap. So, Council may want to revisit some of those prescriptive operational requirements that are in the statute. We'd be happy to go line by line through some of the areas of concern, especially around the step-by-step grant making that just don't seem to line up with where BCYF is going, where philanthropy is going, and just maybe again, with the best of intentions, unintentionally reducing the effectiveness of the work of BCYF. We call on City Council to streamline the legislation, to avoid duplicating the MOU, and to preserve flexibility that meets community needs. So we are hoping for the following. To focus the legislation on oversight principles, specifically around methods and criteria, and not operational procedures. So we are hoping to maintain strong accountability standards, but avoid codifying step-by-step grant-making processes into city code, especially ones that are outdated. Aligning statutory language with the existing MOU and governance framework as well. The second thing we're requesting respectfully is to incorporate some targeted amendments based on grantee feedback to preserve the flexibility for youth programs and rapid response funding specifically. Additionally, to restore the 5% allocation for community engagement, to maintain ecosystem-wide eligibility for capacity building, to align reporting requirements with a risk-based framework, excuse me, I need water. Revisit the 20th% grant cap to allow board-approved strategic investments. And third, if we could convene a structured working session prior to the final passage of the bill. While the working session that Councilman Parker led was very informative, we didn't have time for feedback from a wide group. I think we heard from 4 or 5 voices. And so our suggestion is to have a session that would incorporate if there's 40 people present, we'd like to hear from all 40 people. We have some community partners and grantees that are excellent facilitators that would be able to lead, I think, a more robust feedback session. Ensuring that the final language reflects community implementation conditions and strengthens transparency while preventing unintended operational challenges. So in closing, we believe that these changes could strengthen the council oversight while providing and preserving the intent that Baltimore voters established. BCYF remains available to provide implementation detail, to share our full accountability framework, including the MOU structure or any other documents that people would like to see. We welcome continued collaboration to ensure that the final legislation really strengthens the accountability and partnership between City Council and BCYF while preserving the effectiveness that Baltimore young people deserve. And at the center of this discussion are young people, like this little guy from the Marching Elite, who rely on the programs that BCYF supports for stability, for safety, and for opportunity. So we thank you so much for your time and for your consideration. I just want to share that BCUF is asking for amendments that really strengthen public accountability while preserving the flexibility required to meet youth needs in real time. We need to be able to do both things. And we stand ready to partner with the council, the administration, and community stakeholders to finalize language that reflects both stewardship, thank you so much, and youth opportunity. Thank you so much for your leadership and the opportunity to present and share today. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for sharing with us your feedback in terms of what the bill looks like now, but then also sharing what you heard from your grantees. That's very helpful for us. And I know there'll be some additional questions and comments. I did see initially a question from Councilmember Torrance, so go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and
others let
Mr.
me know.
Vice President. At the same time, I have a question for the Law Department and BCYF, and then also the sponsor. I am just going to be transparent with where I stand. I'm more like split the baby down the middle and pass an amendment that will more likely nullify most of your amendments, but we'll create a different process, a process where we will move policy change for BCYF through the council resolution process that will be signed off by the BOE in the back and forth. That is a public process. So if she wanted to keep her grant making, rapid grant making, she would have a resolution introduced through the administration to us that we then have opportunity to have a public hearing about, then we vote on it and make amendments as possible towards discussing with it. That allows the public to see it, the policy making, and comment on it for 30 days. And then we will move it, and then once it's signed off and signed by the mayor, it is now a policy for the agency. It would be a policy for the nonprofit, but their board and them would send it to us. We would then go through a dramatic democratic process. It may slow down some of the things that they do, but it allows us to establish it, but it's also very public. There's been public hearings. There's been feedback from the law department on how it looks. And I think that is splitting the baby down the middle, and I am proposing it as an alternative.
Thank you, Councilperson Torrance. I appreciate that, and glad to see any written amendments that there are, and glad to talk through all the details as they come up, whether here at this committee or at second or third reader, depending on if our other colleagues who aren't on this committee have their own amendments too. I think that there's two challenges that I just see without having seen your proposal in writing. The two challenges I see are the one, it's the charter that says it's by ordinance that the allocation process is set. And so we do have a charter review commission right now. And so potentially there's an opportunity to introduce flexibility at that level too. But I want to make sure that as the council, we're currently operating within those constraints, that it's by ordinance the allocation methods are laid out and not by resolution. But that doesn't mean that we can't move that direction.
So like the allocation methods, the allocation is done based off of what's prescribed in ordinance. What I'm saying is the policies, instead of telling them how to operate, we will do the operational piece through them submitting their original SOPs and policies to the council. We move it by resolution as the representatives of that body that supports every resident. Then we comment on it as well as provide the community opportunities to comment on it. And then once we get it through the resolution process and it gets to the mayor's desk, then it's an official policy at BCYF. That way it's public in terms of what they're doing in terms of their operational facilities outside of their MOU. The allocation piece, that can stay in the ordinance, but I just want to make sure that we understand like the day-to-day operational stuff in terms of like the policies that they operate through in terms of grant making, that we operationalize it through a council resolution process so that we can then move on it. Because right now, not to simplify this, you invoice us once you make your grant making process. We then give you the funds and then you provide audits based off of those and reports. I just want to make sure that as we move consistently, if we want this to be the people's fund, then the people should be present when policy is being set outside of the board too. The board can operate and vote on it. They send it to us and then we can have a discussion with them about it.
Let me just pause for a quick second because again, I think this is an important part of the conversation. I know Councilman you may have or Councilman Parker, you may have a response, but I do want to also hear from Youth Fund and then also any of the other agencies in terms of what we're hearing. So again, feel free to respond, but I'm also curious in terms of what that will look like in operation too.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate it. We had, in the initial draft of the bill, we had given a lot of authority and flexibility to BCYF we had said, hey, we need you to publish your grant process. We need you to publish your, which they already do, right? So it was trying to just affirm the current practices. The law department came back and said, by the charter, which says it has to be done by ordinance, you can't legally delegate that authority to the youth fund, which is what I had initially put in my bill. And so it feels like we're getting a little close to that there. I think the other aspect is that I would lift up is it depends, like, what does community accountability mean and how do we get there? For me, the most important part of community accountability is at the grassroots level, specifically embedded in the grant review process by the community reviewers, right? And so for me, like, the strongest accountability is a group of grant reviewers that look at all applications, not just some applications for some grant funds, but look at all applications, that every single dollar that passes through BCUF has been reviewed by community members and that they've been part of that democratic process. That's the democratic and the community accountability that I'm most interested in. I appreciate this is also a democratic space where we get to weigh in on things like that. I think drawing more power and more decision-making power back towards the council as opposed to embedding it in community reviewers seems like not the kind of accountability or democracy that I think would be most effective. But I think we're trying to get to that same place.
Yeah, I'm not worried about the allocation piece. I'm just worried about the process, right? So so it's just like with any nonprofit. If you want to move a policy through, you have to do a resolution, right? What I'm doing is marrying the two babies, right? I'm not telling you how to allocate the money. I'm telling you, if you want to change your grant making process and you want to make it a public process for comment period, similar to if we did the JHU police force MOU, we had time to comment on it, right? The public could review it. I'm trying to say that, hey, if you want to change your grant making process and say that we have XYZ policy for the rapid blah, blah, blah fund, right? They send that policy through with a resolution after they go through community voices and everything else about what they wanted from their side of it. We review it as a city because ultimately the money never leaves our coffers anyway until they invoice us. We go, hey, we agree, we go through the council process, the mayor signs off on it, it's an official policy. Then they now have a policy that the city government has reviewed completely from both the executive and the legislative branch. And then if they do get audits, they're able to say that this is consistent, because that's the other thing. If you're gonna do performance audit, it has to be consistent with a policy that's in the city government, right? And if they don't, and that's why I said it's a money grab, no offense to you, but it's a money grab because what are you gonna do performance audit for if the funds never left the city's coffers and they're not connected to a direct administrative policy, right? That is through city government, which is a good.
Couple things. I know we got several questions on the other side of the room, and I know you're marrying babies and splitting them into half and all kinds of stuff going on today on my show. But I do want to hear before we go to questions. Youth Fund. Any response to what you've just heard? I'm just curious.
Yes, I think it's a question around methods and criteria, and doesn't seem to be at least a universal understanding of what those are and like what the scope of those are. So the criteria that are involved in the bill, to me, seem reasonable and fine. But it's the methods piece and how it's now drawn out to include things that, again, are step-by-step processes instead of what I would say are grant-making methods. So for instance, like in this bill, now there's a uniform grant application. Well, all grants, especially the size of the dollars that you're getting, should not be uniform. And as a person who writes grants, I would take offense to having to write a lengthy grant application for a $50,000 grant as the same person who's getting a $250,000 grant. In addition, like some of the components in here, I think there's a call in the bill for the professional experience of the leader to be included. And we can already imagine how for some of the organizations that we serve, their professional experience, whatever that's defined by, becoming a criteria point in an application is an equity concern. So I think there's just some, I don't know when the time is. Maybe we schedule a meeting to go line by line through all of our equity considerations here. But just like, what does methods mean? Does it mean that the council should be creating a grants manual? Because I think that is an operational component. So some of these things are grants manual, like we just heard, they were pulled out of the grants manual. So they're too far into the realm of procedure and policy. instead of just like the methods of operation, which I would think would be more around that you want a process that's transparent, you want a process that's publicly available, you want the steps of that process to be, to be clearly articulated on website and on materials, not detailing in here, what documents people submit in order to apply for a grant, especially when some of those documents are equity concerns. It's the same with this piece around like, with all respect, like the idea of pulling the community grant review out of the public engagement budget just because you were thinking it was important. Instead, we can actually just prepare a report every year, a page in the annual report if you'd like, detailing that as a project. It doesn't need to be pulled out because it does then reduce the amount of funds that are available for other things because those other pieces are capped, right? So now you're capping public engagement at 3%, instead of allowing us to utilize public engagement funds and technical assistance funds to utilize to do the community grant review process. To be quite frank, the community grant review process doesn't cost 2% of the full total budget. So we've shared that, it just doesn't cost that much. So now then what are we supposed to do when we don't spend that full 2%? It's just like too far into the weeds. But instead, if people are interested in like, well, we want to make sure the community grant process is well funded and how is it coming, we can include that in our annual report and some detail so that everybody's understanding what resources go to support those things. So those are just some of the ways that it's just a little, there's just not been enough communication, I think, about what's happening on the ground and like what people really need so that we can move forward well.
No, thank you for that. Just quick response from Vice Chair Parker, and then I have questions from Councilmember Blanchard, Jones, and then Ramos.
I appreciate that. I mentioned that was the one area in particular that we'd had some good conversation, but it hadn't come to the same place. I know at some point it had been lifted up that it was going to be challenging possibly to create that report, but then you went ahead and pulled some numbers for us, which was really helpful. I'm very glad to have at second reader an amendment that would both restore it to 5 and would find language mutually acceptable in the annual report section to call that out. Because the most important thing, for me, it's not just for me, this is a critical part of what makes BSWEB equitable and community accountable. And I think it's important for the council to see one way or another that not only are you doing the work, but also that it's robustly funded.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you, President Lee.
Good. Councilman Blanchard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This bill and all the nuances of all this is a lot and is taking up a lot of my neurons trying to keep track of everything. And I appreciate the thorough dialogue on both sides and everything. To that, I do appreciate the bill sponsors like continued willingness to iterate on this, which I think is really important, and gives me confidence that we're going to figure out the right step forward with all this. I did, Director Lee brought up the programs that are most likely to be impacted, I think mostly because of timings in the grant cycle and whatnot. And I was, definitely interested in knowing if the bill sponsor has a response or a solution about how that can be mitigated or what that would look like.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So community review of grants is vitally important for the public accountability and community responsiveness and equity of the Baltimore Children and Youth Fund. And so, yes, to do as this bill does and apply community review as a consistent piece of every application means that that process takes time, and so is not as fast as an invitation, as a staff review or an invitation basis thing or something like that. It's true, absolutely true. And many traditional philanthropies, charitable organizations, foundations have a quick response mechanism built in. So it's absolutely, to Councilperson Torrance's point, it's absolutely a common practice among kind of traditional philanthropic organizations. The question here came up is whether that model of having a kind of a faster turnaround process that maybe misses some of the steps, like the community review process, where actual neighbors sit down and look at applications and score them, whether that's actually consistent with an equitable use of public funds, right? If there's shortcuts, or if there's not shortcuts, I don't mean that in a negative way necessarily, but if there's faster paths or easier paths that skip steps of community accountability with public funds, is that really consistent with our goal of making sure these public funds are accessible? So I think there's a trade-off between equity and community engagement and speed. And I am suggesting by this bill that that the equity and community engagement and community accountability is important enough to sacrifice some speed and flexibility, recognizing that's exactly what it's doing.
It's challenging for the people
very
who
challenging.
need the funds,
And I'd also say this, I mean, I think it would put pressure on BCOF to say, okay, if all of our funds need to have community review as part of it, is there a way that we can design that and streamline that to make it a faster turnaround?
No, I do want to say too,
yeah,
it's not
please.
just,
Please.
because it's
No,
not-
please, yeah.
It's not just speed. It's the Charm City Youth Athletics, for instance, is not a grant program that needs a community review. Schools are partnering with a roster set of athletic organizations who've been identified, and then we're paying to support their partnership, right? So it's not, and the rapid funds, sure, but these are vetted organizations that have been reviewed by community, right? And that's why they have a grassroots fund grant or community accountable grant. And we need that flexibility to support them to be able to meet the demands that we collectively as the city and BCOF have set on them. They're very expensive. So it is a timeline issue for rapid response. And by rapid, I mean 3 to 4 months. Instead of, it's not 1 to 2 weeks. And then also there are grant programs that we have established that do not require community accountable processes in the same way that we might think about for the grassroots ones. The Charm City Youth Athletics is one such entity where that doesn't make sense for a community panel to select where a soccer program goes and which school gets that
No,
program.
Director Lee, thank you for that nuance. Thank you, Councilman Blanchard, for raising that point. And I know Councilman Torrance has something on it. Jones, did you have anything else on this front? Yeah. Jesus, y'all don't.
Sorry, very, very brief.
We have some decorum in it.
Yeah, sorry.
Call on you. That's when I call on you. All right, I'm moving to the next people. Okay, people say stop pressing the microphone buttons and stuff. Okay, when I recognize you. All right. Now who's up next?
Okay, really quickly, just to level set, with your survey, and that, people respond on the legislation, is that post or pre these amendments that we are looking at today?
Sure, it's post, it was after the latest working session. We sent the survey out last Thursday.
Got it, thank you. And I noticed with the survey, there was a lot of percentages, and just to kind of really look at the impact of the survey, are there actual numbers, like approximately how many people were surveyed?
Yeah, I have an analysis report that I can share with the committee.
Okay, thank you, because, percentages could be, 2 people, 5 people, and just trying to get clarification on that. Thank you, that's helpful, just to kind of get, no, thank you, and just love that, one last thing. When it comes to surveying folks who rely on the organization for grants, often do you feel like it may be necessary to also maybe survey the general public? Because some may think that because they're relying on you all for grants, they feel the need to have to lean a certain way in order to continually get funded.
I think the survey questions would have to be different because we were asking our grantees about specific operational components that they experience by being a grantee. But I think a different survey out to the youth development ecosystem would be really helpful, especially around the impacts around capacity building. Like with the current bill as it states, you would have to be tax exempt or fiscally sponsored to participate in capacity building. Yeah, it's online. It's under the exempt section. Exemption, I can pull it up. I think it's like section 92C. So that would handicap so many organizations in terms of a pathway to be a BCOF grantee. And we'd be happy to help to provide, access to that survey or even to help develop it.
Thank you for that clarification. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm done. I'll leave it alone.
Go ahead, so we can get to Ramos. Quick one. This
Just one quick question. Your grant reviewers, are they a combination of board members, community, and some outside people? And what's the number?
Sure, thank you so much for that question. We usually have between 25 and 35 community grant reviewers. Usually 45 to 48% of them are young people, so people ages 14 to 24. They are absolutely never a board member because the board members vote on their recommendations at the end. A good percentage of them are sometimes current grantees, meaning not the executive director, but they might send a staff person. So sometimes they're grantees, and I think that number is about 20 to 35%. And then the rest are community members that have exhibited some knowledge or expertise that's really helpful. In this bill, I think it would require a community grant reviewer to have experience working in the with youth development. But we actually find that while that's one helpful skill, there are other skills that create a more diversified pool of panelists. So we wouldn't want that. That's also a point of concern as well from the bill.
Are any of those, have you ever considered asking an elected official to be a part of?
We would love that.
And I say that because, you know, Park Heights and the Pimlico Development Board has a group of grantees, basically, that review grants to go back into Park Heights with different organizations. And it is a combination of elected officials, community leaders, business leaders, and it's been very successful.
Thank you for that, Council Vice President Milton. I appreciate that. Not only the question, but also the clarity that you provided as well. Councilmember Ramos, thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a really, I think, important topic for us. It's public funds, so we obviously want to, make sure that they're utilized to make the best impact, which I think you have that shared goal as well. I was a executive director of a nonprofit several times. I will never do it again, but I like being in public service. But it's because it's really like you're worried about salary and paying your people, and all you're doing is raising money. And so I get the need to make sure that that stress is minimized so they can actually do the work, right? But I also know that we need some accountability as well. So it's a really tough balance that I think we're all trying to strike here. And I hear this all the time, even from community development groups, about all the crazy reporting that we have to do for all of the other grants. So I totally get it. I had to do it myself. I don't want to do it anymore. But I do want to try to figure out how we strike that balance, because we do need that accountability, but at the same time, I want people to do the work, and all of the reporting. So just to sort of preface that by, Mr. Hofstadter, I have a question about what the sponsor brought up in terms of what exactly it means, because I couldn't find it in the fairly lengthy bill report, that the ordinance is where the operational piece comes from. And I'm coming from not only the nonprofit background, but also as one of the leaders of the founding of the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, where we had to strike a balance in the charter amendment as to who's on the board, and we gave very strong principles about how the money would be used, but otherwise it's super flexible as long as it's been used in a certain way. And then we had an ordinance that was the funding source, which is, it's a slightly different, but if we're looking at funds writ large, as we are doing in the charter review, this is one of those questions that I have. So can you talk a little bit more about this notion that the operations piece has to be an ordinance?
Yeah, so again, the charter language talks about the methods and criteria for both identifying the programs and for allocating the funds. It needs to be spat out in an ordinance. Now, I think that that's something like a spectrum. On one side would be sort of an impermissible delegation of the council's, legislative duty to put something like methods and criteria in an ordinance. And I think the point of that part of the bill report on file is that the original draft of the bill, by simply requiring the fiscal sponsor to come up with those methods and criteria was too much of that delegation. But and, you know, and then it sounds like what is on the table now is what is too far on the other side of that, right? Like too much day-to-day sort of operational legislative enactments. In between there, you know, there's room for a lot of reasonable interpretation, and I think that's where your work all is tending now.
I appreciate that. So I'm hopeful we can come to whatever that looks like in terms of balance, because again, we want people to do the work, not have to do all the reporting, but we need the reporting in order to make sure that we're spending public dollars. So it is a tough balance for sure. I would push back a little bit on my colleague's suggestion, because our role, I don't want everything to go through the BOE. I mean, I certainly don't want that, but I don't know that our role is really that programmatic policy piece either. So there has to be some way, maybe you come before us more often, maybe there's a way that if any policy decisions come through us, it would have to be an ordinance, and it would have to be you know, something that rises to that level, not necessarily that it's an operational policy that would come before us, because I can't imagine that we would be doing those as well. So I'm just saying, like, it feels to me like there needs to be a little bit more conversation around what that balance looks like, and so that we can, you know, have confidence in that. And I appreciate the explanation from the law department on that as well. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Law Department. Yeah, as I mentioned, I mean, the attempt to describe the grant-making process here while leaving as much flexibility as possible for the discretion of the maximum legal amount by the charter of discretion possible for the fiscal sponsor BCOF is really important. And that's certainly what we've tried to do so far. And with the close consultation of law to help us tease out the nuances of what can be accomplished by ordinance and what can be left unsaid or left flexible, I think we can get closer to it in that stretch. And so I'm glad to have that further conversation with the law department riding alongside us to help inform it, because we took your advice and tried to work through the best we can, and having your continued guidance in interpretation of the charter on that point would be helpful.
Councilman Torrance?
And I'm just principally worried because I don't like to tell people how to do their work. The only time I ever felt like I needed to tell somebody how to do their work was DCHD, in terms of like operations for like their actual like staff. In terms, it was a whole different ball game, right? Because we know it doesn't work. Here we are dealing with, and I call it a great experiment, right? We did something that was different than what nationally others haven't done. Then we now have created a nonprofit. That nonprofit entity has a board, and then that board makes decisions. What I wanted to do was put in the ordinance that if there is a significant policy change, that they'll do a resolution before the council so it's public, and we can have hearings on it. That way the public has it, right? It provides the opportunity for comments, and then we can just pass the ordinance out after they've had the public. We need to ensure that there's a public process for those policy changes. It doesn't say we voted up or down on whether we accept the policy or not, because it's non-binding, but it's a proper opportunity for that to have a public process. The other piece is that for in my other happiness, and right now I'm just gonna tell you where my vote stands, is no right now, because the Comptroller's Office wanting to add additional staff is unacceptable when in the MOU you have the opportunity to actually do audits, right? Or ask that the agency, and if I reviewed the MOU correctly, you could have asked them for an audit that you could have reviewed, which they pay for yearly, which is best practice. And I'm just at a standstill because I have Black and brown people who depend on this fund, like football teams who rapidly need funding to get to national championships in Florida, who will then have to wait longer because we're dictating the grant process. And I'm just being transparent from meeting with some grantees. They said they won't reply, right? We are now operationalizing something that is hindering marginalized people from getting access to private dollars that traditionally would have access through most of philanthropy. To give you an idea, most of the major funds in the city were funds that were created based off of the marginalization and accelerating mortgages on Black and brown people off of Fulton Avenue. And now we're asking for funds for those same organizations to stay afloat. We now have created a fund that's separate from it. I think we have to find a balance that respects that history, but also addresses that I have neighbors who never picked up a pen to do any of this, right? I've been supporting, you guys supported Showdown for Sandtown when I didn't have a recreation center, and that filled in that gap for that community. They didn't have that capacity. I had to go out to Parks and People to help them get a physical sponsor, to help get that capacity. This is not, and I say this because we are handcuffing someone who has to handhold organizations and help them grow without reservation. And sometimes it is the ugliness of, have you ever did an audit? Because you have met the $400,000 threshold. Do you have a functional board? Do your board members know if you can't make payroll, everybody in here has to write a check to make payroll, and helping them facilitate those conversations? Or I've seen this organization walk through people through the board cycle and how to bring on board members and what to look for expertise in those board members. I think this is hard because then we've gone from creating something that's flexible to inflexible and just pulling out their grant manual, when that could be a public conversation that they provide us every year and by ordinance here, walking us through what their grant process is and outlining it, right? Those are ways that we put checkpoints on the policy, in the policy making, and the operation, because if there is, then we know we can step in with ordinance to fix that operation, rather than doing something without, I hate to say this, we are searching for a problem to fix rather than asking and having the organization bring in organizational management people to say, hey, and looked at their audits and say, this is what we've learned and this is what we believe we should change, and walk through the public process for that. I think that's more strategic, by requiring every couple of years that they do a deep dive in their operations and make recommendations for changes. I'm just trying to split the baby because I get where you're coming from. I get what the media is trying to say about this Black and brown thing. But for me as a Black and brown person, I have to vote no, because I'm not hampering something I know is working without the understanding of what it could implicate, right? Because if I have grantees saying they're not gonna apply, then we might as well just rate the fund and just start using it to balance our budget at this point, and send it over to Rec and Parks to build new recreation centers and do programming.
So Councilman Torrance, just thank you for your comments. I'm going to make a general statement, and we can move on from here. I know we've had a couple of terms, and I'm glad you talked about, capacity, some of the gaps that we see, particularly in West Baltimore, and there are other areas as well. I know there have been a couple of words been talked about before. We talked about transparency. We've talked about, again, capacity. But I would just say, and to your point, us focusing on what are the challenges that we're trying to address? What is the problem that we're trying to solve, right? And how are we actually improving the process of getting funds to our young people? I think it's important for us to really do this in a deliberative fashion. We don't have to necessarily rush through it, but at the same time, so we're all on the same page and know that if we take one piece out of one area, how it's affecting the other areas as well. So again, just make sure that we're very clear on those pieces. I see Councilmember Ramos, and then go back to sponsor.
Sure. Mayor's office is not here, but I would like to hear from the mayor's office at some point in time today. I had a question for the comptroller's office. My understanding of the fiscal note, or whatever we're calling it, on the audit was that what I heard the comptroller say at the last hearing was that the 300,000 or whatever it was is not just for this, but that it was a set of, because he's got it broken down into certain, agencies go at certain times in terms of their audits, and that he wants to actually add a whole nother set of organizations that would get audited, which BCYF would be part of, that would be that amount. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
So then can you tell us what the actual amount would be? It would be the same staff that would be doing these groups, but it sounds like what we need in terms of clarity is exactly what that cost would be just for the BCYF part, rather than saying, we're gonna do a whole group of them and it's gonna cost this much without that express, because I think it adds the confusion.
That's not a number I know off the top of my head, but I can work with our auditor to get that for you.
Okay, could that be a formal request then? It sounded to me from the last hearing that he's got a certain amount of pins that he wants to dedicate to pick a number of organizations or agencies that would be audited. So I would like to have a little bit more specifics about what the comptroller is talking about there so that we can say, okay, if there's, I'm making this up now, 5 agencies, including BCYF, that are gonna be done with this 300,000, again, making that up, dollars, then you do the math and that's how much it's gonna be. But he didn't do that. He said it's gonna cost us this much and we're gonna add some organizations. We don't have that clarity. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand.
Thank you.
Answer the request and then back to Parker.
I would like to know the exact pins, the exact salary, the exact fringe benefits, because I'm pretty sure this was a prior budget enhancement, and I just don't want this to be the vehicle of said budget enhancement, because that's the smell test I'm getting right now, that this is a vehicle for a budget enhancement, because then it is a legislative requirement to the executive branch to do this thing. And I just don't want it to be on the backs of Black and brown people to explain that I get formal new staff people. I want to know what the exact pins are, what the exact agencies are, when the hiring period will be.
So Councilman Torres, just can you rephrase that request?
I want to know
Simplify it.
I want to know the exact pins. Is it an auditor 1 and an auditor 2, a staff assistant to assist with it, from their fringe, including everything, and even down to what the potential cost would be for their retirement at this point. Okay, we can make that happen.
Got that. Parker?
Well, I think Councilwoman Ramos has a question from OGR.
Hi, yeah, I don't know how much of the discussion the mayor's office has been part of today or listened to, and just kind of trying to understand where the mayor's office is on all of this.
Yeah, thank you for that. So we continue to work in partnership, obviously, with Councilman Parker and with BCYF. It sounds like there are a couple more conversations that need to be had so that we can get everybody on the same page here.
So are you gonna be the ones putting everybody together to make this happen?
We'll work with the sponsor. I mean, it's not our bill. But, you know, we obviously have a vested interest in seeing to it that whatever comes from this is a responsible piece of legislation that both the council and BCYF can be proud of.
Thank you.
I have a question. I think that several entities here can talk about. So, and again, in terms of transparency, I know one of the things that we're doing right now is a working session, but I also understand that you also have a working session you have planned. Can you speak to what that looks like? Because I want to make sure that we're all on the same page so we can get this thing moving.
There's a session scheduled on the books for Councilman Parker to speak to the board. That will be the first time that he'll have the opportunity to present about the legislation to the board. I believe that is at the retreat, so that should be in a week or two.
The 25th, I think, is the date, right? Yeah.
That's the session we have, and then we are asking for a second working session just to just facilitate it a little differently. It was wonderful to talk through the bill, you know, but we didn't get a chance to get that feedback.
So I want to make sure I'm clear and everybody else is clear. So as a function of, well, being a member of the board, attending a board retreat, and that you're going to present this to the, or let me just get through it, that you're presenting, that there could be, or slated to have a potential presentation to a board retreat, and then you're also trying to do an internal working session amongst the board, and then I want to just make sure we know what's going on.
The retreat session would be a working session led by Councilman Parker. It would be that initial presentation of the bill to the full board, and then I'm sure they'll have some questions and feedback. And then we're also requesting a second grantee and maybe also board member session that's just facilitated a little differently so we can get more feedback on the language and impacts. Because I do think like the survey that we sent out, some of that, the 89% saying they feel highly concerned, that may be news to, I think, the councilman, but we didn't get a chance to hear from everyone, right? So with that new information that so many folks are concerned, I think it would be great to have another working session where we actually work through the language that's there and get more feedback. So having a facilitated session led by a grantee or a community member who's just more, who has that facilitation skill set.
Okay, and I appreciate you answering that. I know there's also, thinking about any survey, and I say this as a researcher, how the questions are asked, how they're framed also matters in terms of the response that we get, so there's a lot there. Anything from Parker or MOGR before we go on?
No, I look forward to continued conversations with MOGR and with BSUF leadership. I'm not committing to that additional session at this time. Look forward to the conversation with the board, as well as that conversation that we just spoke about, directly kind of workshopping the grant review process with the law department to make sure that we're achieving the flexibility we need and also the specificity the charter calls for, which they can help us get there. And your experience certainly will get us there a long way. The other things that I've heard today, and it's just want to repeat some commitments I've made relative to amendments and changes. One is the 25% capacity building, which addresses conversation we've had with MOGR, as well as addresses some of this feedback that that came from at least the grantee surveys that you presented today. So we'll work on that one as part of our next steps here. The 2% to 5% on public engagement with, and I really appreciate you bringing up, with the caveat of a really robust reporting aspect in the annual report that we can put in there. I think we're trying to get to the same place, which is what I've said completely, and so want to make sure we're there. I do really appreciate you bringing up, and thank you for the reference there in 9.2C, absolutely unintentional to restrict, because capacity building isn't just for current grantees, capacity building is for prospective grantees and all the rest. And so I think there's a really easy fix to that, because that's a huge part of one of the things BSUF does really well is investing capacity building in the broader ecosystem, whether they're potential grantees or just interested people. And so want to make sure that we absolutely capture that. That's really important, and I thank you for being attentive to that detail.
Well, thank you. Councilman Blanchard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Request that I have for BSUF, and I'm sure we can just set it up through Mr. Hanson. But having gotten a couple grants and done grant stuff for different community things in the past, because this is taxpayer money, like I fully understand why we need to have a really robust conversation around accountability. B, I fully understand, like I have cursed under my breath at grant requirements in the past, and that was not even for stuff that I was doing for a living, right? And so I would like to just set up a time for someone to walk me through what the reporting requirements are now, and then what we would expect them to be, if the bill passed with its current amendments. That would be really helpful, because they're both important goals. I just kind of want to see that myself.
I would just like to then also advocate around the rules and regulations document that we're working with the Department of Finance on. They've been really wonderful in partnership, but that is, I think, circulating through city government, and that would also set a precedent. The grantee task force that was assembled in 2023 submitted a revised rules and regulations document that they worked on with internal staff, and we really would like that either approved or not, so that we can move forward to set up new reporting that would be less onerous, but would still uphold accountability and transparency. So just to advocate for that as well.
And Councilman Blanchard, thank you for that very astute request, because again, we look at those numbers in terms of the survey responses, thinking about what are folks actually responding to and the difficulties in terms of reporting. And I say that also as a former executive director of a nonprofit too, so we all feel the pain.
Yeah,
Parker, please.
No, along those lines, thank you, President. Thank you, Councilperson Blanchard, for the question. Thank you, President Lee, for bringing up rules and regulations. I mentioned that this bill changed the cadence, right, to make the quarterly fiscal reporting as the default, with the exceptions and the flexibility to BCOF to institute more regular. I was gonna say the other part that isn't in this bill, because it's governed by rules and regulations, is what those reports consist of, which also grantees have given tons of great feedback to us, to BCOF as part of that process, and then to the city to update that document. And so they certainly can. We'll certainly be glad to share with you the current, the recommendations, and I think we all should be engaged in helping us get there, because it's a really important part of making this whole thing work better and have less of a burden on the grassroots organizations that we're trying to support.
Councilman Torrance, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To that vein, I would just like to see a copy of your contracts that you do with grantees, because I've seen one before, and from the language I saw, you have a stronger clawback clause than the city government does in terms of grant funds. And I think the council should see the accountability written into the grant agreement, because there's some people who don't want to be a fiscal sponsor, because if you mess it up, the city has a strong clawback clause, and they're going to come for the money. It's going to be an automatic judgment because they don't have a choice once they prove that you can't accept them. And I go because those conversations happen when one of the grantees who made missteps emailed us all and got all the money clawed back, and probably will have to pay them back a lot more money. But I think that we need to understand, like, what's best practices, because I'm sure that clause came as soon as we started thinking about it. And then also looking at best practices, because we don't have this type of regulation for our good friends at the Civic Fund. I want to be equitable about how we treat it, because the Civic Fund also applies for grants on behalf of some of us, for us to be reporting. So I just want to make sure that, like, we need to be transparent about that. Like, I don't want to be rules for thee and not for me. And I think that we need to have that conversation deeper.
No, really good points. Any additional questions?
I just wanted to add, you'll also have in the slide deck that you have, there's 2 slides at the end around some of the process that the councilman is discussing. We have a very in-depth compliance practice here, and we don't, I just want to, as a note, we don't just claw back money without a lot of intervention. You know, we do really believe in an equitable process around that. So, and our director of compliance is here. So just wanted to make that one little nuance.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate that. I'd say both in the description, I appreciate you bringing that up, and Brandon, you adding there. The attempt to give some, again, from my perspective, but we'll keep working on it, flexible structure to the grant-making process wasn't to address any concerns at all as to how BSWF, I think BSWF does that in a really robust way. I think the accountability is really strong in that process. It was meant to try to handle our charter responsibilities to describe the means and methods of allocation as best as possible. And so certainly it's not meant as a criticism. I mean, that's why it wasn't in my first draft, because I didn't have any concerns. That was not a problem I was trying to solve, because I think BSWF does that really well. And so I think getting to a place where the law recognizes and supports that and gives the flexibility necessary there is good. I think, Councilperson Torrance, it seemed like you had a few other thoughts, certainly around the audit side of it. I know we asked for more information, but very glad to keep working with you on any particular, I heard both in terms of the audit and in terms of a resolution aspect. I look forward to resolution aspect around policy that you had brought up several times. Well, I'd love to speak with you about both of those and see what could it look like.
Yeah, because we only pass non-binding resolutions, but if we're truly about keeping it a fund that is accountable to the public, if the public is able to see our hearings, hear about us, them walking through the rationale for the policy change, I think that's fair game, because it's educational too. Because I'm just being transparent with you. The efficacy of people looking for information in this country has drastically changed, right? In terms of ChatGPT, it's not gonna be correct. So if we have a written record and the legislative record moving forward of when they made policy changes and we kept track of it, then future council can go back and say, hey, the council, and they passed this thing, they provided publicly, it's available, because our record is a long-standing record on the organization, right? when I talked to the bill, to the sponsor, the founder of this organization in terms of like this bill sponsorship, his issue was about the audits. He just wanted an audit done. That was the one thing I had from my 7-minute conversation. I just want an audit done, right? And just want the audit done in a way that is respectful for the organization. And I'm just transparent. I'm respectful of people's bodies of work. And that, to me, for someone who has previously sat on this council, led this council, and ultimately led this city, to say he's just worried about the audit portion of it, that to me gave me a charge that everything else should probably go through like a resolution process to say that we're keeping up with good maintenance. Because to be truthful with you, whatever you put in that grant manual now or the process, it's gonna have to change within a year, because that is the landscape of philanthropy. And the fact that, give you an example, if you put Black and Brown in that manual now, she probably wouldn't be able to apply for federal funding because of the landscape of the federal government level, right? That's why I think we need to be mindful that those things could change over on a dime, right? And we need to be respectful of it. And then the fact is that finance here, what's the current balance of the fund the dollars that are still in our coffers for the BCYF fund that we haven't given? $17 million, right? If there's $17 million in that fund and we're only taking small portions of it and we're doing multi-year grant making, we're looking at stability. Before this happened, in the feedback, that grant manual changed when I first got into council to multi-year grant making, because grantees were here at the actual oversight hearing. They're saying that it does not provide me stability. We had 2 hours of this does not grant me stability. They responded, went out and created a multi-year grant making process. And I think that's why I want to do it through the resolution way, because they can provide the policies, people can come and give feedback, and that ultimately allows us to hear that they hear feedback. This was public record about it. It's not happening in the silo of their board meeting. I'm just opining a way where it meets the baby in the middle without overly stepping, because most people will tell you, you don't want your board deep into your operations because they're just gonna muck it up, right? And I think this is the way to balance it. Like, for small grants and flexible micro grants, I can tell you that most foundations have 2 staff people that approve it. They just do their due diligence and sign off on it, and they're able to issue it within like a week or 2, depending on how much the funds are. And we have to think that through.
So Councilman Torrance, I appreciate you talking about the ever-changing landscape of grant making, and especially the federal context that's not lost on us. What I would say, I think would be helpful, because I know we've talked about, transparency, we've talked about democratic process. I know we have several amendments that are in front of us, and also requests for additional conversations. What I believe would be helpful, and folks can chime in, I'd love to hear your perspectives on it, but for us to have some additional time for folks to make sure they're on the same page, that we come back and we get a chance to actually work and vote on some of these pieces. But what I would like to see is another opportunity for folks to meet amongst themselves, whether it be MOGR, BCYF, the bill sponsor, come up with the whole list of amendments we're looking at, and then tell us where you stand on them, right? Who's opposed, who's for them, so we have a clear delineation of where people stand, so we're on the same page. So I want to make sure that we are moving in order, but also we're not doing this in a piecemeal fashion, and we're not rushing it through, because I don't want to rush something through and then come back and have to, deal with it a bunch of times, okay? Is that amenable to folks? I'll look at you, and then we'll go on and see what you're thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've certainly laid out some additional amendments that I'll be working on. I heard from my colleague, Mr. Torrance, that there are at least 1 or 2 that he's interested in. I think I'm only trying to think kind of like procedurally, because a number of the amendments that are already proposed are at this point based on feedback that we've received extensively and have come to an agreement on language-wise and all the rest, between me as the bill sponsor, the mayor's office, city schools, BCYF. It would be helpful for us to differentiate between the amendments that are kind of like we feel like are in a good place, and those which we're going to continue to evaluate. Not that we can't come back to them, but I think at this point, there's 16 amendments, and I think being able to say like, okay, these are the specific ones that that we really want to keep working on would certainly help me focus my efforts in those conversations.
No, that's helpful. What I would say, and I see Torrance as well, are there, and there may be some difference of opinion, but since we're opening it up, are there specific amendments that BCYF, MLGR, and the bill sponsor are all in agreement with? If not, then I wouldn't be comfortable moving. And then Torrance has a question, so y'all can figure it out between yourselves.
Yeah, I have a question. Why is city schools reviewing amendments?
The original draft of the bill, what you'll recall, added and it's still in there, but another amendment has taken it out, called for a member of the city board of school commissioners to be added. And based on feedback from city schools and from law, we removed that in a subsequent amendment.
Oh, okay. They only provided feedback on that amendment.
Yeah.
Okay, I was just making sure because that sounds like an ethical issue because they receive funds from the fund. That's another. I mean, I'm happy with that amendment because they actually receive funds from the fund, so they shouldn't actually be technically have a member of the board of commissioners on there because they're part of the entity receiving the funds.
Yeah, exactly right.
Update this table that we've shared with the amendments that will change and send that over within 48 hours.
That'll be helpful. Again, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. I don't want to have multiple, again, conversations are helpful, but MOGR, is that your understanding or your position?
I mean, again, like largely at the onset of this, what we talked to the councilman about was that we wanted to work in partnership with BCYF. We want to do our best to bring them along with the councilman as well, right? So if there are, I mean, a couple of outstanding pieces, I think that we should be able to address them. I mean, I understand where the councilman is coming from with the addition of a community engagement session. We would need to talk about the timing of that and then making sure that you do still have enough time if, based on that feedback, there are edits to amendments or new amendments, whatever could happen, that DLR will have time to draft. Like, so we just need to talk about timeline, what works for the sponsor of the bill. It's him, you know, doing a favor to not push here, that we could have more time to have a conversation and just get this done. I think that's just where we are. We have to do this in partnership. I think that's the only way that this works.
Yep. Yeah. I think we have I think I've laid out the areas in particular, both towards Mr. Torrance and towards BCOF, that I'm certainly going to be giving my attention to. And as we make progress on that, I will update the chair and members of the committee as to how we get along.
And I'll say this too, I'm thinking about us both being together, starting a half marathon together. You have to have a finish line in sight, right? So we are going to get to a finish line here. So the next time that we come in front of this committee, I want us to be able to have a whole list of amendments that we can vote out so we can get this thing going. Does that sound about right? Yeah. So let's put the urgency of now into action and make sure that we can have these conversations so the folks are on the same page, moving forward, and everybody's clear. I think we're in a good space. Are there any questions, additional questions or comments from any members of the committee? Any representatives of any government agencies? Going once, going twice? Okay, so what I will say is this. I do appreciate the attention and detail that Vice Chair Parker has put into this bill. I also appreciate all of the feedback and very astute questions from the members of this committee. Also appreciate the BCYF for the work you do continuously on this front. The mayor's office, but also the comptroller for being here, and law for always helping us to understand what's going on and how to sift through some of these pieces. Again, I do want us to get to a finish line, but I don't want us to rush there. I want us to be deliberate and get there in one piece so so that everybody gets what we need, especially for our young people in the city. So with that, we're going to continue some more work on this bill. And at this point, we will stand adjourned. So again, thank you all so much for your time today.